My name is Jules Harper. I am 36 years old, a dentist with my own small practice on the east side of town, and until one Thursday afternoon in March, I believed the house I had spent 7 years paying off with my own two hands was the one thing in my life nobody could touch. The call came in during a routine cleaning, my hygienist mouthing the words, "bank calling," urgent, while I still had a suction tool in a patient's mouth. I stepped into the hallway, gloves still on, and a woman named Denise from Meridian Trust asked me to confirm my identity before she would discuss, in her words, the suspicious activity flagged on a home equity application filed under my name that morning. I told her there had to be a mistake. I had not applied for anything. She read me the loan amount. $94,000 secured against my house, the one I had bought at 29, painted myself, planted a garden behind, the one my younger sister Hannah and her husband Tyler had been living in for going on 3 years now, ever since they moved in temporarily while they looked for their own place. Denise asked if I recognized the signature on the application. I asked her to send me a copy. What arrived in my email 20 minutes later was my name, written in handwriting close enough to mine that most people would never notice the difference. Close enough to fool a loan officer glancing quickly through a stack of files. Not close enough to fool a dentist who spent every single day of her career comparing signatures on consent forms, checking that the name scrawled at the bottom matched the patient sitting in the chair because insurance companies did not forgive sloppy paperwork, and neither, it turned out, did I. The J curved wrong. My real J snapped back sharp at the base, a habit from my father teaching me cursive at our kitchen table when I was 7. This J rounded soft and lazy, the kind of curve someone makes when they've practiced a signature from memory instead of copying it from a card. I sat in the hallway of my own practice, gloves still smelling of latex and mint, staring at a signature that was almost mine, attached to a debt that was entirely mine, and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very cold at the same time. Because if this application had reached the underwriting stage, that meant somebody had already gathered my Social Security number, my income statements, my property deed, everything a lender needed to approve a loan this size. And the only people who had that kind of access to my mail, my files, my life, were the same people I had trusted enough to hand my house keys to 3 years ago and never once ask for them back. My phone buzzed again before I could even process the first shock. A text from my mother. "Dinner. Sunday, don't forget, Hannah has an announcement." I stood there in the hallway for a long moment, my patient still waiting in the chair with her mouth propped open, and thought about how many announcements my family had made over the past 3 years without once thinking to include me in the planning. To understand how I ended up standing in that hallway holding evidence of my own forged signature, you need to understand what temporary actually meant in my family, because it had never once meant what the dictionary said. Hannah is 4 years younger than me, the kind of sister who could walk into any room and make people feel like the party had finally started. I was always the practical one, the one who filled out financial aid forms correctly the first time, who chose dentistry because it was stable, who bought a modest 3-bedroom house at 29 with a down payment I'd saved for 6 years by skipping vacations and driving a car with 200,000 miles on it. Hannah married Tyler at 24, a charming, restless man who had gone through 3 different business ventures by the time he turned 30, each one launched with total confidence and each one collapsing within 18 months. Always for reasons that were never quite his fault. When Hannah called me crying 3 years ago, saying their landlord was selling the building and they had nowhere to go for at least a few months while they found something new, I said yes before she even finished the sentence, because that's what sisters did. I had a spare room and a finished basement. I told them to stay as long as they needed while they got back on their feet. A few months became a year became 2. Somewhere in there, Hannah got pregnant, and the conversation shifted from, "We're looking at apartments," to, "It doesn't make sense to move a newborn twice." And I understood, and I let it go, because what kind of person kicks out her pregnant sister? My parents, Linda and Frank, started coming to Sunday dinners at my house instead of theirs, since it made more sense with the baby. And somewhere in that shift, I noticed I had gone from being the host to being something closer to a guest in my own kitchen, watching my mother rearrange my cabinets to fit Hannah's baby bottles more efficiently, watching my father hang a new mailbox out front, because the old one, in his words, looked tired. I told myself I didn't mind. I told myself family helped family, and that keeping score was small and petty, the kind of thing bitter people did. The first real conversation about the house happened at Easter, almost 2 years ago now, my mother waiting until Hannah had gone upstairs to nurse the baby before turning to me with the particular gentle tone she used whenever she was about to ask for something large. "Jules, sweetheart," she said, "have you thought about what happens long term, with the house, I mean?" I said I hadn't really thought about it beyond Hannah and Tyler finding their own place eventually. My mother exchanged a look with my father, the kind of look married couples develop after 30 years. A whole conversation passing between them without a single word. "Well," she said carefully, "the thing is, with the baby, and with Tyler's new venture needing some runway, it might make more sense for the house to just, formally, become Hannah's. You're single, you don't need 3 bedrooms, and honestly, you could get a nice little condo somewhere, something easier to manage." I remember laughing, actually laughing, because it sounded so absurd, stated plainly like that. "I bought this house," I said, "with my own money." "And we're not saying you didn't," my father said quickly. "We're just saying, practically speaking, it makes sense for the family." I said no, clearly, calmly, the way I'd say no to a patient asking me to skip a necessary root canal because it cost too much. "No, I'm not transferring the house." They dropped it that day. But it came back 3 months later, framed slightly differently. My mother mentioning how much easier her own mother's estate had been to settle because everything had been arranged in advance. No messy surprises. It came back again around Thanksgiving, framed as concern for the baby's stability, since children needed roots, needed to know the home they lived in was truly theirs. Every single time, I said no. Every single time, I told myself that was the end of it, because I had said the word clearly enough that reasonable people would simply stop asking. I did not understand yet that my family had stopped listening for my answer a long time before I ever gave it. What I noticed, looking back later with the particular clarity that only comes after betrayal, were the small administrative shifts that had crept into my life so gradually I never flagged a single one as strange on its own. My mother had started collecting my mail from the box at the curb whenever she visited, since she was already out there anyway, she said, and would just leave it neatly stacked on my kitchen counter. Somewhere along the way, stacked became sorted, and sorted became handled, my mother mentioning once, almost offhand, that she'd already paid the water bill for me since I looked swamped that week, using a checkbook I didn't remember giving her access to. I had signed a limited power of attorney for my mother 2 years earlier, right before a minor surgery I'd had on my shoulder, purely so she could handle small things, prescription pickups, a utility call, if I was too out of it on painkillers to manage it myself. I had never revoked it afterward, because it never occurred to me that a document meant for 2 weeks of recovery could still be sitting active in a filing cabinet, unused and forgotten by me, remembered very precisely by someone else. Hannah, meanwhile, had access to something I hadn't fully considered until much later. 3 years of living in my house meant 3 years of knowing exactly which drawer held my important documents, which folder my accountant labeled year-end statements, which shelf held the fireproof box with my property deed and Social Security card, because she had walked past that shelf in the hallway every single day on her way to the laundry room. None of these details felt significant in isolation. A mother helping with mail, a sister living in a shared space, a minor legal document signed for a temporary medical situation. It was only once I understood what all 3 had been quietly combined to build that I saw the shape of something that had never been accidental at all. The Sunday after the bank called, I drove to my parents' house instead of hosting dinner at mine, telling my mother I had a migraine and needed a quieter evening, which was true in the sense that everything about my head hurt, just not from any migraine a normal person would recognize. I sat at their kitchen table, the same table I'd done homework on as a kid, and waited until dessert before I set my phone down in the middle of the table, screen facing up, the photograph of the forged signature glowing between the coffee cups. "Does anyone want to explain this to me?" I said. My mother's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. A flash of pure panic, gone almost as fast as it appeared, replaced by the calm, patient expression she used when she thought she could still manage the situation with the right tone of voice. "Jules, honey, I'm sure there's an explanation," she said. "Where did you even get that?" "The bank sent it to me," I said, "along with the loan application. $94,000 against my house, filed this week." My father set down his fork very carefully, the particular carefulness of a man choosing his next words like they were live wires. "It wasn't meant to happen like this," he said quietly. "There it was. Not what document, not what loan, not confusion, but it wasn't meant to happen like this." The sentence of a man confirming guilt while still trying to manage its delivery. I felt something in my chest go very still. "So it's true," I said. "You knew about this." Hannah appeared in the kitchen doorway then, the baby monitor in her hand, her face pale in a way that told me she'd been listening from the hallway the entire time, waiting to see how much I already knew before deciding how much to admit. "Jules, it's not what you think," she said. "Then tell me what it actually is," I said. "Because right now, what I think is that somebody forged my signature on a mortgage application, and I'd genuinely love to hear a version of that sentence that sounds better than it does right now." Silence settled over that kitchen table, the way it does right before something finally breaks open after being held together too long by politeness alone. My mother spoke first, her voice small in a way I had never heard from her before. "Tyler owes money," she said. "Not credit card money, not a bank. A real person, someone he borrowed from when his last business fell apart. Someone who doesn't send polite letters when payments are late." "How much?" I asked. $80,000, my father said quietly, with interest accumulating fast enough that it was already closer to 90 by the time we— He stopped himself. "By the time you what?" I said. "By the time we looked into refinancing your house to cover it," he finished, unable to meet my eyes. I sat there absorbing the fact that my family had decided the solution to my brother-in-law's debt to a dangerous lender was to quietly mortgage the house I owned outright, using a signature none of them had the legal right to produce, and somehow expected that if it worked cleanly enough, I would simply never need to know any of it had happened at all. "Whose idea was the signature?" I asked. "Because someone practiced that. Someone sat down and copied my handwriting carefully enough to fool a bank, and I want to know whose hand actually held the pen." Nobody answered right away, which was, in its own way, an answer. "I did that part," Hannah finally said, barely above a whisper. "Mom found an old birthday card you'd signed years ago, and I practiced from it for a week before the loan officer meeting. I looked at my sister, the woman I had let live in my house for 3 years, rent-free without complaint, without a single moment where I made her feel like a burden, and understood that somewhere in those 3 years she had spent actual practice time forging my name onto a legal document instead of simply asking me directly whether I would help. "Why didn't you just ask me?" I said. "If Tyler's in real danger, why didn't anyone just tell me the truth and ask?" My mother's answer arrived fast, defensive, the words of someone who had clearly rehearsed this justification long before tonight. "Because you would have said no," she said. "You always say no when it's something big. We didn't have time to argue with you about it while Tyler's situation got worse every single week." I sat with that sentence for a long moment, feeling something shift permanently inside me. "So the plan wasn't to ask and risk hearing no," I said slowly. "The plan was to make the decision without me and only tell me once it was already done, because a done thing is harder to undo than a request is to refuse." Nobody corrected me. Nobody could, because I had just described exactly what had happened with more accuracy than any of them wanted to hear, stated plainly out loud. I drove home that night with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind moving faster than it had in years, cataloging every detail the way I cataloged a complicated case before a difficult procedure, because panic solved nothing and precision solved almost everything. The first thing I did the following morning, before opening my practice was call a lawyer named Priscilla Ndiaye, recommended by a colleague who had gone through a messy business partnership dispute 2 years earlier and still spoke about Priscilla like she'd personally saved her career. Priscilla listened to the entire account without interrupting, occasionally asking a sharp, precise question that made me realize how much of this story I hadn't yet fully assembled myself. Forged signature on a mortgage application is serious on its own, she told me. Bank fraud, potentially, depending on how far the application progressed before it was flagged. But I want to understand the full picture before we decide how hard to push. Do you have anything beyond the signature itself? Anything showing premeditation, timeline, who knew what and when? I told her about the years of small administrative shifts, the power of attorney, the mail, the folder Hannah had access to. She told me those details mattered enormously because premeditation changed everything about how a prosecutor or a judge in a civil suit would view the severity of what had happened. Get me anything you can find, showing this was planned rather than a single desperate moment, she said. And Jules, be careful how you gather it. I don't want anything obtained in a way that becomes its own legal problem later. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't drink, I opened the shared family cloud photo album my mother had set up years earlier so everyone could dump vacation pictures and birthday photos into one place without emailing them individually. I had never really browsed it beyond the occasional holiday scroll, but now I went back methodically, month by month, searching not for photos of people, but for anything that looked out of place. I found it 11 months back, a folder Hannah had created entitled, without any apparent awareness of how it would read to anyone but herself, Hannah's Fresh Start. Inside were screenshots of kitchen renovation quotes, paint swatches, a contractor's estimate for converting my finished basement into what the notes called the baby's real room once were official, and a group text thread screenshotted in pieces between Hannah, my mother, and my father, discussing timeline options for when we can actually move forward with Jules's place. I read that thread 3 times, my tea going cold beside me, understanding fully for the first time that this had never been a single desperate decision born from panic over Tyler's debt. The debt had simply become the excuse that finally justified moving a plan that had already existed for the better part of a year. I sat with that realization longer than I sat with almost anything else that week, because somehow finding proof of a long, patient plan hurt in a different way than finding proof of a single, reckless mistake. A mistake meant people who loved me had panicked and done something terrible under pressure. A plan meant people who loved me had spent months quietly deciding my life belonged to someone else's future and simply waited for the right moment to make that decision permanent. The next piece of proof I found, I did not go looking for at all. It found me in a way that felt almost too precise to be coincidence. Though Priscilla assured me later it was simply the natural result of a habit I'd built years earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. I had installed a basic home security system 4 years ago, a doorbell camera and 2 small indoor units, one covering the living room and one angled toward the kitchen, purely because a rash of daytime break-ins had hit my neighborhood that spring, and I lived alone at the time and wanted peace of mind. The system saved footage to a cloud account for 30 days before automatically overwriting it, footage I almost never actually watched unless a package went missing, except 8 months ago, right around a plumbing issue that had flooded part of my basement. I had exported and saved several days of footage to send to my insurance company as proof of when the leak began, footage that happened to include an entire afternoon I had completely forgotten about. An afternoon when I was at a dental conference 3 states away and my parents had come by to check on the repair work. I found that saved footage while searching my old email attachments for the insurance claim, and out of an instinct I couldn't fully explain at the time, I opened it and watched. My mother and father sat at my kitchen table, Hannah across from them with the baby asleep and a bouncer at her feet, the 3 of them talking in the easy, unguarded way people talk when they believe absolutely no one else can hear them. Once the loan clears, my father was saying, We tell her it was always meant to happen eventually. And honestly, by then she'll have moved on with her life enough that it won't feel like such a big loss. She's not going to just agree to any of this, Hannah said. You know that. That's why we're not asking her to agree to anything, my mother replied, her voice calm, practical, discussing the logistics of my life the way someone discusses a grocery list. Frank still has that old power of attorney paperwork from her surgery. That's how we already have her Social Security number, the deed, the income statements, everything the bank needs except the actual signature. And that paperwork never covered anything like a mortgage. Hannah's already been practicing that part. By the time she notices anything's different, it'll already be handled. I sat in my kitchen 4 years later, watching that same table on a small glowing screen. My own house recording the exact moment my family decided my consent was an obstacle to plan around rather than a decision to respect, and felt something inside me finally, completely, harden into resolve. I sent everything to Priscilla the next morning. The forged signature, the renovation folder, the group text screenshots, the security footage, time-stamped, unedited, my own home quietly bearing witness to a betrayal that had been assembled with more patience than most people invest in an actual house. Priscilla called me within the hour, her voice sharper than I'd heard it before. "This changes the entire conversation," she said. "This isn't a family disagreement anymore, Jewel. This is documented, premeditated fraud, and depending on how you want to handle it, we have real options that don't require you to simply absorb the damage quietly the way I suspect they're expecting you to. I want it stopped," I said. "I want the loan killed before it processes any further. And I want my family to understand, clearly, permanently, that this is over. Then let's build this properly," Priscilla said, "quietly for now. Because the moment they realize how much you actually have, they'll either panic and destroy evidence or panic and lawyer up immediately. And I'd rather we control the timing of that reveal ourselves." Before any of that began, Priscilla asked me one more question that I hadn't considered carefully enough on my own. "Do you actually know who Tyler owes this money to?" she asked, "because if we're building a case, I want to understand exactly what kind of pressure was sitting behind your family's decision to do something this reckless." I didn't know, not specifically, only the vague shape of it that my parents had offered at their kitchen table. Detective Ruiz, once I brought her into the picture the following week, took less than 3 days to find out. The lender was a man named Reese Calloway, technically operating a small private investment firm downtown, though Ruiz's tone when she said the name told me everything the polite title was designed to obscure. 2 prior complaints existed in the system, both withdrawn before charges could be filed, both involving delinquent borrowers who had stopped cooperating with investigators shortly after receiving what one report vaguely described as a personal visit regarding repayment expectations. I sat with that information for a long time after Ruiz shared it, feeling the shape of my anger shift slightly without softening. My parents hadn't simply chosen greed over honesty. They had been genuinely frightened, perhaps not entirely without reason, and had responded to that fear by making the worst possible decision available to them, one that solved nothing about the actual danger and instead created an entirely new one aimed squarely at me. It didn't excuse the forgery. It didn't excuse the year of quiet planning documented in a folder titled with my sister's own hopeful, careless honesty. But it explained in a way that made the whole situation feel heavier rather than lighter. Why nobody in that kitchen had considered simply asking me directly. Fear rarely thinks clearly, and my family's fear had apparently decided that forging my name was somehow the responsible choice, the adult choice. The choice that protected everyone except the one person whose signature they'd stolen to make it happen. I asked Ruiz whether Tyler himself was in any legal danger regarding Calloway. She told me that borrowing money from an unlicensed private lender wasn't itself illegal, however predatory the terms. Though Calloway's collection methods were a different matter entirely, one her department was already quietly building its own file on independent of my case. "If you ever end up in a position to help build that case further," she added carefully, "it could matter for more people than just your family." I told her I would think about it. I meant it, though not yet. Not while I was still standing in the wreckage of my own house being quietly mortgaged out from under me. Priscilla moved fast over the following 2 weeks. She contacted Meridian Trust's fraud department directly, providing documentation that immediately froze the loan application and flagged it for their own internal investigation, which meant the bank itself, not just my family, was now formally treating this as attempted fraud. She filed a police report for identity theft and forgery, walking me through a process that felt strangely clinical for something that had upended my entire understanding of my family. An officer named Detective Ruiz, taking my statement with the same careful, patient thoroughness I tried to bring to a difficult patient case. The forged signature alone is enough to open a criminal case, Detective Ruiz told me. The security footage removes any doubt about premeditation. I want to be honest with you. Cases like this, family cases, they're hard because prosecutors know juries hesitate to convict people over what looks like a family dispute. But documented planning like this, that's a different category entirely. I asked her what my options actually were. She explained that I could pursue criminal charges against Hannah specifically for the forgery, since the security footage and text evidence pointed most directly at her hand on the pen, while my parents' role, discussing plans and possibly facilitating access through the old power of attorney, occupied murkier legal territory that a prosecutor would need to evaluate carefully. Alternatively, I could use the threat of criminal referral as leverage in a civil resolution, forcing a clean, permanent legal separation from my family's access to my property and finances without necessarily sending my own sister to trial. I did not make that decision quickly. I thought about Hannah's baby, my niece, who had done nothing but exist inside a plan built around her before she was even born. I thought about my parents, who I still, somewhere underneath the fury, loved in the complicated, unconditional way children love parents, even after those parents disappoint them completely. And I thought about the version of myself who would have to live with whatever I chose next for the rest of my life. I told Priscilla I wanted them to fully understand the consequences, in front of each other, with real stakes attached, before I decided how far to actually push it. Priscilla arranged the confrontation carefully, choosing a family gathering already scheduled 2 weeks out, my niece's first birthday party, a setting my parents had specifically chosen, I would later realize, because they assumed the celebratory occasion would make me reluctant to cause a scene. The party filled my parents' backyard with balloons and a small crowd of relatives, my niece in a tiny party dress smearing frosting across her face at the head of the table while everyone cooed and took photos. I arrived with Priscilla waiting in her car down the street, a printed folder in my bag, and a calm I had spent 2 weeks building deliberately, piece by piece, the same way I built calm before any difficult procedure. I waited until the gifts had been opened and the cake cut before I asked my father, quietly, to gather the 4 of us, plus Tyler, inside the house for a few minutes. Once we stood in my parents' living room, the muffled sounds of the party still drifting through the window, I set the folder down on the coffee table and opened it slowly. "This is a copy of the forged mortgage application," I said, sliding the first page across. "This is the folder Hannah created, titled Hannah's Fresh Start, with renovation quotes from my basement dated 11 months ago. And this," I said, pulling out my phone and turning the screen toward them, "is footage from my own security camera from 8 months ago, of the 3 of you discussing how to use an old power of attorney to gather everything you needed, and a practice forgery to cover what it didn't, all without ever asking my consent." The color drained from every face in that room at almost exactly the same moment. Tyler, who I realized in that instant had gone completely silent since I began speaking, finally spoke, his voice thin with something that sounded almost like relief mixed with horror. "I didn't know about the signature," he said quietly, looking at Hannah. "I knew about the debt. I didn't know you forged anything." Hannah didn't answer him. She was staring at the folder on the table like it might disappear if she looked at it hard enough. My mother reached for the phone first. "Jules, please turn that off," she said, her voice cracking in a way I had genuinely never heard from her before. "I have copies," I said, "several, with a lawyer, and a detective who's already taken my statement. The word detective landed in that room like a physical object dropping onto the floor. "You went to the police," my father said, his face going pale in a way that made him suddenly look much older than I'd ever noticed before. "I went to the bank first," I said, "because they're the ones who called me, remember? And then, yes, I went to the police, because someone forged my legal signature onto a document that could have cost me my house." "We're your family," my mother said. The same argument she'd used 100 times before, except now it landed with none of the weight it used to carry. "Family doesn't forge my signature," I said. "Family doesn't discuss my house on hidden cameras like I'm an obstacle to plan around." Family asks, "You never once actually asked me. You decided, and then you planned how to manage me once the decision was already made." Hannah finally spoke, her voice small, defensive in the particular way people get when caught rather than genuinely remorseful. "We were trying to protect Tyler. You don't understand what kind of people he owes money to." "Then you should have told me that," I said, "instead of practicing my handwriting off an old birthday card for a week." The room went silent again, the sound of the party outside almost obscene in its cheerfulness against the wreckage unfolding inside. "Here's what happens now," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "I'm not pressing criminal charges against Hannah. Not today. Not because I've forgiven anything, but because I don't want my niece growing up visiting her mother in a courtroom over this. But that decision comes with conditions, and they are not negotiable." I laid them out clearly, the way I'd rehearsed with Priscilla over the previous week. The old power of attorney would be formally revoked that week, in writing, with a lawyer present. Hannah and Tyler would be out of my house within 60 days. Enough time to find something reasonable, not enough time to drag this into another year of delay. My parents would no longer have any access to my mail, my accounts, or any document with my name on it, effective immediately. And if anyone in that room ever again attempted to access my property or finances without my direct, written, witness consent, the folder currently sitting on that coffee table would go straight to Detective Ruiz, without a single additional warning. My father tried one last time, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Jules, we made a mistake, but we're still your parents." "You are," I said, "and I'm still your daughter. That's exactly why I'm giving you the chance to fix this quietly instead of publicly. Don't mistake that for weakness. It's the last kindness I have left to offer any of you right now." Nobody argued further. What was there left to argue against a folder of documented proof and a detective's business card sitting on top of it? I left the party without going back outside, walking straight to Priscilla's car, where she was waiting with the engine already running, watching my face carefully as I climbed in. "How did it go?" she asked. "About as well as delivering root canal news to a nervous patient," I said. "Nobody's happy, but everybody understood exactly what happens next." The 60 days that followed felt, in some strange way, like the calmest stretch of my life in 3 years. Hannah and Tyler found a small rental across town within 5 weeks, moving out with considerably less drama than I'd braced myself for, mostly because Priscilla had made it very clear in a formal letter exactly what remained on the table if they delayed. My mother and I spoke exactly twice during that period, both brief, both entirely about logistics, neither containing anything close to an actual apology, which told me everything I still needed to know about how much genuine reflection had happened on her end. My father called once, alone, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I keep thinking about that footage," he said, hearing myself say those things out loud. "I didn't know I sounded like that until I heard it play back." "I didn't either," I told him honestly. "I don't think any of us know exactly what we sound like until somebody plays it back to us." He didn't have much to say after that. I didn't need him to. Some conversations exist simply to be had, not to be resolved. I had the old power of attorney formally revoked within the week, Priscilla filing the paperwork herself to make sure it happened cleanly and permanently. I changed the mail delivery instructions at the post office, requested a formal fraud alert on my credit file, and had a locksmith rekey every door in the house the same weekend Hannah moved out, not out of spite, but out of the plain practical understanding that trust once demonstrated to be entirely conditional, needed real boundaries, rebuilt from the ground up rather than simply assumed back into place. 6 months later, my house is quiet, in a way it hasn't been in 3 years. The guest room empty, the basement finally, genuinely mine again. No renovation quotes waiting in a hidden folder for a future that was never supposed to include my consent. I see my niece twice a month, arranged directly with Hannah through short, businesslike texts that have replaced whatever warmth used to exist between us. A relationship reduced to its practical bones, still standing, just no longer pretending to be something it clearly wasn't for years. My parents came to dinner at my house exactly once since the birthday party, a careful, quiet evening where nobody mentioned mortgages or basements or old birthday cards, where my mother helped with dishes without touching a single drawer she hadn't been shown, where my father left without hanging a single new thing on my wall. It wasn't warm, it wasn't healed, but it was honest, in a way 3 years of comfortable arrangement never once managed to be. I think sometimes about that curved J on the forged signature, the small, imperfect detail that unraveled a plan a year in the making. And I understand now that it was never really luck that saved me. It was the exact same instinct that made me good at my actual job, the refusal to let a small inconsistency simply pass without question. The belief that details mattered precisely because people assumed nobody was looking closely enough to notice them. My family assumed love meant I would eventually stop asking questions. They assumed patience meant permission. They assumed that if they waited long enough, quietly enough, carefully enough, my house would simply become the family's house, and I would learn to call that fairness instead of loss. They were wrong about all of it, and the proof of exactly how wrong sat recorded on my own security system the entire time, waiting patiently in a cloud server for the day I would finally need to watch it back. I did not lose my family the day I opened that folder in their living room. I lost the version of my family I had spent 3 years pretending was still there, the one that had actually stopped existing long before I ever pressed play on that footage. What I found instead, standing in my own reclaimed kitchen 6 months later, drinking tea in a silence that finally belongs entirely to me, is something I hadn't expected to feel this strongly after everything. Peace, unearned by anyone but myself, and entirely worth every uncomfortable conversation it cost to finally claim it.
Thank you so much for watching. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.